The piercing shriek of the emergency drill alarm tore through the morning air at Naval Special Warfare Training Center, its metallic wail echoing off concrete walls and steel structures like the cry of some mechanical predator. Commander Skylar Thorne stepped into the formation lines with the measured precision of someone who understood that every movement was being evaluated, cataloged, and judged. Her compact 5'6" frame moved with an economy of motion that spoke of careful training, while her neon blue hair caught the harsh California sunlight like a beacon designed to draw exactly the wrong kind of attention. Staff Sergeant Brock Kellerman turned at the sound of her approach, his 6'3" frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the space around him. The military-issued camo uniform stretched across shoulders that looked like they had been carved from granite, and his dark eyes swept over the new arrival with the kind of assessment that preceded a predator's strike. When those eyes registered the slight figure in the deep V-neck military green shirt and worn brown combat boots, something shifted in his expression from professional evaluation to barely concealed contempt. Seriously? They're letting fashion models into SEAL qualification now? Kellerman's voice carried across the formation with the deliberate projection of someone accustomed to commanding attention through intimidation. His gaze traveled from the striking blue hair to the porcelain-fair skin that looked like it belonged in a cosmetics advertisement rather than on a military training ground. "Princess, this isn't a photo shoot. When bullets start flying, your pretty face won't save your team." The ripple of laughter that followed his words spread through the assembled candidates like a wave breaking against a shore. 23 male voices joined in various degrees of amusement, from nervous chuckles to outright guffaws, each response carefully calibrated to demonstrate solidarity with the unofficial hierarchy that Kellerman's physical presence and aggressive confidence had already established. The sound created a wall of exclusion that was as tangible as any physical barrier, designed to isolate the target and demonstrate the cost of not belonging. Skylar stood motionless, her pale blue eyes fixed on some point beyond Kellerman's shoulder, with the kind of thousand-yard stare that suggested either complete dissociation or the mental discipline of someone who had learned to endure far worse than public humiliation. Her grip on the M4 rifle remained steady, fingers positioned with a precision that would have impressed any weapons instructor if they had been paying attention to technical competence rather than social dynamics. The military green fabric of her shirt emphasized the athletic definition of arms that were clearly stronger than they appeared, while the dark army pants and worn combat boots suggested someone who had acquired her gear through use rather than requisition. "Hope you've got your daddy's number on speed dial," Kellerman continued, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who had found an audience responsive to his particular brand of entertainment. "Because when this drill goes live, little girls like you become liability real fast. This is where boys become men, sweetheart, and where pretenders get people killed." The security cameras mounted at strategic points throughout the facility captured every angle of the confrontation with the kind of comprehensive coverage that suggested this moment would be reviewed, analyzed, and filed away in personnel records that would follow careers for decades. The image they recorded told a story that seemed almost archetypal in its simplicity. A mountain of masculine authority asserting dominance over someone who appeared to represent everything that traditional military culture viewed with suspicion. David versus Goliath, except this David carried no sling and showed no sign of divine favor. What none of the observers knew, what the cameras could not capture, and what would become clear only through events that were about to unfold over the next 27 minutes, was that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple case of military hazing. The woman they were dismissing as an obvious mismatch for elite special operations carried credentials that would have shocked every person present, including the facility commander watching through monitors from his climate-controlled office 3 floors above. The sound of helicopter rotors spinning up in the distance provided a mechanical counterpoint to the human drama playing out on the formation ground. Combat simulation equipment hummed to life with the electronic whine of systems designed to test human limits under conditions that approached the chaos of actual warfare. Somewhere in the facility's depths, computers were already calculating variables and preparing scenarios that would push today's candidates beyond their perceived capabilities, separating those who merely thought they belonged from those who could actually perform when everything went wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Wade Garrison emerged from the administrative building with the measured pace of someone who understood that authority was best demonstrated through controlled confidence rather than obvious haste. His uniform bore the creases and insignia of a career spent climbing the special operations hierarchy, while his weathered features reflected the kind of experience that came from making life-and-death decisions in environments where mistakes carried permanent consequences. At 47 years old, he had reached the point in his career where reputation mattered more than performance, where maintaining position required careful management of perception rather than constant demonstration of capability. As he approached the formation, Garrison's eyes swept across the assembled candidates with the practiced assessment of someone who had been evaluating special operations potential for more than 2 decades. His gaze lingered on certain individuals longer than others, noting not just physical attributes, but the subtle indicators of mental state, confidence level, and group dynamics that would determine how each person performed under pressure. When his attention reached Schuyler, something flickered across his features that might have been surprise, calculation, or concern. The expression disappeared so quickly that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed it at all. "Ladies and gentlemen," Garrison announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that automatically commanded attention without requiring raised volume. "Today's qualification drill represents the culmination of 3 weeks of preliminary assessment. What you have experienced thus far has been preparation. What begins in 15 minutes will be evaluation under conditions that approximate actual special operations requirements." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle across the formation like morning fog. "The scenario involves urban warfare simulation with live opposition forces, underwater navigation under stress conditions, and tactical decision-making with incomplete information. Standard safety protocols remain in effect, but I want to be absolutely clear about expectations. This is not training, this is testing. Those who demonstrate the capabilities we require will advance to the next phase. Those who do not will be reassigned to positions more appropriate to their actual skill level." The emphasis he placed on the word actual was subtle but unmistakable, and his eyes remained fixed on Schuyler throughout the entire statement. The message was clear to everyone present. Some people would be exposed today as being fundamentally unsuited for the roles they were seeking. The question was not whether failure would occur, but who would experience it and how publicly that experience would unfold. What happens when someone who looks harmless turns out to be anything but? If you've ever been judged by your appearance only to shock everyone later, smash that subscribe button right now. This story is about to get intense, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Hit the notification bell, because the revelation ahead will change everything you think you know about first impressions. Dr. Elena Cross observed the formation from her position near the medical station, her trained psychologist's eye cataloging the subtle behavioral indicators that revealed far more about each candidate than their official files ever could. As the facility's combat psychologist, she had developed an expertise in reading the intersection of personality, capability, and performance under extreme stress. Her role involved not just treating post-traumatic responses, but identifying individuals whose psychological profiles suggested exceptional potential for special operations work. What she saw in Schuyler's behavioral pattern immediately captured her professional attention. The complete absence of defensive posturing in response to public humiliation suggested either pathological dissociation or the kind of emotional regulation that came from extensive training in stress management. The way she held her weapon indicated familiarity that extended far beyond basic instruction, while her stance reflected muscle memory that spoke of countless hours in tactical situations. Most intriguingly, her respiratory pattern remained absolutely steady, despite being the target of group mockery, suggesting either remarkable natural composure or learned techniques for maintaining operational effectiveness under psychological pressure. Dr. Cross made detailed notes on her tablet, documenting observations that would later prove to be far more significant than she could have anticipated. Professional instinct told her that Schuyler represented either a complete psychological anomaly or someone whose background contained elements that weren't reflected in her official documentation. The discrepancy between appearance and behavioral indicators was too pronounced to be coincidental, suggesting layers of complexity that would require careful investigation to understand. Equipment distribution began with the methodical efficiency that characterized all special operations preparation. Each candidate received identical tactical gear, communication equipment, and weapon systems that had been calibrated to test specific capabilities under controlled conditions. The process involved not just physical distribution, but electronic verification that every piece of equipment was functioning within specified parameters and that all safety systems were operational. Skylar approached the equipment station with the same measured pace that marked all her movements, accepting her assigned gear with professional courtesy that revealed nothing about her level of familiarity with the items she was receiving. However, as she performed the standard inspection routine that all candidates had been taught, her fingers moved with automatic precision that suggested muscle memory developed through extensive repetition. The way she checked the M4's action, verified the communication system's frequencies, and adjusted her tactical vest's configuration demonstrated technical competence that exceeded what should have been possible for someone at her supposed experience level. Captain Rex Donovan watched this process with growing unease that he struggled to conceal beneath his professional demeanor. At 34, he had built his career on attention to detail and careful adherence to protocol, qualities that had earned him respect throughout the special operations community. However, recent events had placed him in a position where those same qualities created dangerous complications rather than professional advantages. The encrypted message he had received 18 hours earlier remained burned into his memory like a brand. The communication had been brief, untraceable, and absolutely clear about consequences if he failed to comply with specific instructions regarding today's qualification drill. Someone with access to information that could destroy his career and potentially result in criminal charges had given him orders that conflicted with his duty, his conscience, and his understanding of what was right. As he watched Skylar's competent handling of equipment that should have been unfamiliar to her, Donovan felt the weight of knowledge that he could neither act upon nor ignore. The orders he had received specifically mentioned her, providing details about her background that weren't contained in any official file he could access. Someone wanted this woman eliminated from the program, and they possessed leverage sufficient to force his cooperation in achieving that goal. The urban warfare simulation facility represented the culmination of decades of special operations training evolution, a multi-level structure designed to replicate the complex environments where modern military actions actually occurred. 3-story buildings with interconnected corridors, unexpected obstacles, and hidden chambers created a maze that required not just physical capability, but tactical thinking, spatial awareness, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. As candidates were organized into teams, Kellerman maneuvered himself into position to ensure that Skylar would be assigned to his group. His reasoning was transparent to everyone present. He wanted the opportunity to demonstrate her inadequacy through direct comparison with more qualified personnel. The team composition that resulted from his machinations placed 5 experienced candidates under his informal leadership, with Skylar assigned the role of rear guard, ostensibly for her own protection, but actually to ensure that her inevitable failure would be witnessed by the maximum number of observers. "Stay behind us, Princess," Kellerman instructed, with exaggerated patience as the teams prepared to enter the simulation facility. "Watch how real operators handle business. Maybe you'll learn something before you wash out." His teammates responded to this performance with the kind of supportive laughter that reinforced group solidarity while further isolating the target. The dynamic was familiar to anyone who had observed military culture: the establishment of hierarchy through demonstration of dominance, the reinforcement of group identity through exclusion of perceived outsiders, and the creation of shared experience through participation in collective behavior that defined who belonged and who did not. What none of them understood was that they were about to participate in an evaluation that would test far more than their individual capabilities. The facility's sensors would record not just their tactical performance, but their responses to unexpected challenges, their treatment of team members under pressure, and their ability to adapt when their assumptions proved incorrect. The data collected would be analyzed by specialists whose job involved identifying potential rather than confirming prejudice. The simulation began with controlled chaos that immediately sorted the candidates into categories based on training, instinct, and psychological resilience. Sound effects designed to approximate urban combat filled the air with cacophony that made communication difficult and decision-making stressful. Smoke generators created visual obstacles that required teams to navigate by compass, memory, and tactical intuition rather than simple sight-based movement. Kellerman's team entered the facility with aggressive confidence that reflected their leader's personality and tactical philosophy. His approach emphasized speed, overwhelming force, and straightforward problem-solving that had served him well in previous training environments. The team moved in standard formation with Kellerman at point, experienced operators covering flanks and middle positions, and Schuyler maintaining rear security in accordance with her assigned role. However, within the first 3 minutes of the exercise, subtle anomalies began to emerge that would have been visible to trained observers. Schuyler's movement pattern reflected spatial awareness that extended beyond normal sensory input, as if she possessed additional information about the facility's layout that hadn't been provided in the briefing. Her weapon handling demonstrated not just competence, but the kind of automatic precision that spoke of extensive combat experience rather than training familiarity. Admiral Jonas Blackwater observed the unfolding exercise from the facility's command center, his weathered features reflecting the kind of professional interest that came from decades of evaluating special operations potential. At 61 years old, he had reached the apex of his career through careful attention to details that others missed, combined with an understanding of human nature that allowed him to see potential where others saw only surface characteristics. The monitor displaying Schuyler's team showed tactical movement that didn't quite match the patterns he would have expected from the team composition indicated on paper. Someone was providing guidance that exceeded the capabilities that should have been available, and the source of that guidance wasn't immediately apparent. His eyes narrowed as he focused on details that suggested layers of complexity beyond what the official documentation revealed. "Interesting," he murmured to his aide, a young lieutenant whose job involved monitoring communications and documenting significant events for post-exercise analysis. "Run a background verification on candidate Thorne. Full spectrum, all accessible databases." The aide's fingers moved across his keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing systems that would provide comprehensive information about any individual within the military database structure. However, after several minutes of searching, his expression shifted from routine competence to puzzled concern. "Sir, there appear to be access restrictions on portions of her file. Some sections require clearance levels above my authorization." Admiral Blackwater's attention shifted from routine observation to focused investigation. In his experience, clearance restrictions on personnel files indicated either security concerns or involvement in operations that existed outside normal military structure. Neither possibility was consistent with someone participating in standard qualification training. "What clearance level is required?" "The system indicates, sir, it's requesting confirmations that I don't recognize. Some kind of specialized access protocol." The implications of this information began to reshape Admiral Blackwater's understanding of what he was observing. Someone participating in his facility's training program carried credentials that were classified beyond his immediate access, which suggested involvement in operations that he wasn't authorized to know about. The possibilities were limited, and all of them indicated that today's exercise might be significantly more complex than standard qualification testing. Petty Officer Nash Rivera had been observing the team dynamics with the kind of careful attention that characterized his approach to everything in military life. At 26, he possessed the combination of technical competence and emotional intelligence that made him valuable in special operations environments where success depended as much on understanding people as understanding tactics. His role in today's exercise involved communication support and medical backup, positions that allowed him to observe without directly participating in the leadership dynamics that were developing within each team. What he witnessed in the interactions between Kellerman and Schuyler struck him as fundamentally wrong in ways that extended beyond normal military hierarchy or training stress. The level of personal hostility directed towards someone who had done nothing to earn it violated his understanding of what special operations culture should represent. More troubling was the way other team members automatically participated in behavior that seemed designed to undermine rather than evaluate. During a brief pause in the exercise, he approached Schuyler with the kind of careful neutrality that allowed him to offer support without directly challenging the established summer structure. "Don't let them break you," he said quietly, his words barely audible above the ambient noise of the simulation environment. Some people confuse loudness with leadership. Real capability doesn't need to announce itself. Schuyler's response was a slight nod that acknowledged his support, without requiring verbal commitment that might create complications for either of them. However, the brief eye contact that accompanied her acknowledgement revealed something that surprised him. Rather than gratitude or relief, her expression conveyed a kind of calm assessment that suggested she was evaluating him rather than seeking his protection. The realization left him with questions about what he was actually witnessing and whether his understanding of the situation was as complete as he had assumed. Someone who could maintain that level of composure while being systematically undermined possessed either remarkable psychological resilience or experience that prepared her for far worse treatment than anything she was likely to encounter in a training environment. The advanced tactical communication systems used by elite military units require specialized encryption technology that maintains secure connections even in hostile environments. Professional-grade communication devices designed for high-stakes operations utilize military specification components that ensure reliable performance when standard civilian equipment would fail completely. These tactical communication solutions include features like encrypted voice transmission, GPS tracking, and emergency beacon capabilities that are essential for personnel operating in sensitive military environments where communication security is absolutely critical for mission success. The first major tactical challenge of the exercise involved close-quarters battle simulation in an environment designed to test decision-making under extreme stress. The facility's rooms had been configured to present scenarios where split-second choices determined success or failure, where hesitation meant death, and where teamwork made the difference between accomplishing the mission and becoming casualties. Kellerman's team approached the challenge with aggressive confidence that reflected their leader's tactical philosophy and personal style. His plan involved overwhelming force applied with maximum speed, a straightforward approach that had proven effective in previous training scenarios and matched the capabilities of his experienced team members. The strategy required precise coordination and absolute trust in each team member's ability to execute their assigned role without hesitation or deviation. However, when the team encountered their first simulated hostage scenario, the dynamics shifted in ways that revealed capabilities no one had anticipated. The situation involved armed opposition holding civilian targets in a room that could only be accessed through a single entry point covered by overlapping fields of fire. Standard doctrine called for coordinated entry with suppressive fire and immediate neutralization of threats, executed with the kind of mechanical precision that training was designed to develop. What actually occurred defied every assumption about team composition and individual capability that the exercise had been designed to test. As Kellerman prepared to lead the assault, Schuyler moved with fluid precision that seemed to bend the rules of physics and tactical limitation. Her approach to the hostage situation demonstrated techniques that weren't taught in any standard military training program, involving spatial manipulation, timing, and threat assessment that spoke of extensive experience in actual combat environments. The simulated enemies found themselves responding to a threat pattern they couldn't identify or counter effectively. Their programmed responses, designed to challenge experienced special operations candidates, proved inadequate against someone who moved like water through obstacles that should have been insurmountable. Within 47 seconds, the hostage scenario had been resolved with 0 casualties and complete neutralization of opposition forces. The control room fell silent as observers processed what they had just witnessed. Training scenarios were designed to be challenging, but achievable by qualified candidates working as effective teams. What they had just observed involved individual capability that exceeded the parameters used to design the exercise, suggesting either a fundamental flaw in their assessment systems or the presence of someone whose background was significantly different from what her documentation indicated. Dr. Cross made urgent notes on her tablet, documenting behavioral observations that would require immediate analysis and potentially official reporting. The psychological profile she was developing suggested either severe dissociation from reality or extensive combat experience that hadn't been disclosed during the application process. Neither possibility was consistent with standard qualification protocols. Kellerman stared at Schuyler with an expression that combined surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been the first hint of respect. His understanding of what had just occurred was limited by his own experience and training, but even he could recognize that what she had accomplished shouldn't have been possible for someone at her supposed skill level. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity and growing concern about what else he might not understand about his newest team member. Schuyler's response was delivered with the same measured neutrality that characterized all her interactions. Improvisation is sometimes necessary in fluid situations. The scenario presented variables that required adaptation rather than standard response. The answer was technically accurate, while revealing absolutely nothing about the source of capabilities that clearly extended far beyond improvisation. Her tone carried the kind of professional courtesy that deflected further inquiry without creating obvious evasion, suggesting experience in maintaining operational security under questioning. The tension is building, but you haven't seen anything yet. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to see this. The best part is still coming. The underwater navigation phase of the exercise was designed to test psychological resilience under conditions that pushed human limitations to their breaking point. The facility's pool system created an environment of deliberately limited visibility, strong artificial currents, and obstacles that required not just physical capability but mental discipline to overcome. Candidates were required to navigate a complex underwater course, while maintaining team coherence and accomplishing specific tactical objectives within time limits that allowed no margin for error. Standard Navy SEAL requirements called for candidates to hold their breath for a minimum of 2 minutes while performing complex tasks underwater. The exercise was calibrated to push this requirement to its absolute limit, testing not just physical capacity but psychological resilience when faced with the kind of life-threatening stress that characterized actual combat operations. What observers witnessed when Skylar entered the water immediately challenged every assumption they had made about human physiological limitations and training capability. Her approach to underwater navigation demonstrated not just competence, but the kind of effortless efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in aquatic environments far more challenging than any training facility could safely replicate. The electronic monitoring systems tracked her progress through the underwater course with growing amazement from the technical staff responsible for maintaining safety protocols. Her breath-holding capability extended well beyond 4.5 minutes, approaching the kind of performance that required either specialized medical intervention or training techniques that weren't available through standard military programs. More significantly, her movement pattern underwater revealed spatial awareness and tactical thinking that suggested familiarity with underwater combat operations that went far beyond standard Navy training. She navigated obstacles with precision that indicated either perfect memory of the course layout or the ability to maintain tactical awareness in conditions where most people would experience severe sensory limitation and psychological stress. Captain Donovan watched this performance with growing anxiety that he struggled to conceal from the other observers. The encrypted instructions he had received specifically warned him that Skylar's capabilities would exceed her apparent qualifications and directed him to ensure that her performance was undermined through equipment malfunction or procedural complications that would create the appearance of legitimate failure. The moral weight of these instructions was crushing him with every passing minute. His entire career had been built on the foundation of integrity and dedication to the mission above personal considerations. The idea of deliberately sabotaging a qualified candidate violated everything he believed about military service and personal honor. However, the leverage his unknown contact possessed made refusal impossible without accepting consequences that would destroy not just his career, but potentially his freedom. As Skylar completed the underwater phase with performance that would have impressed experienced Navy SEALs, Donovan made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He activated the equipment malfunction protocol that would create the appearance of technical failure during the next phase of the exercise, providing justification for eliminating her from the program based on factors beyond her personal control. The explosive breach training that followed was designed to test candidates' ability to think tactically while working with dangerous materials under extreme time pressure. The scenario required teams to calculate precise charge placement for structural modification while maintaining safety protocols that prevented injury to personnel or damage to facilities beyond acceptable parameters. Standard doctrine for explosive breaching involved careful measurement, calculation, based on material composition and structural design, and safety procedures that had been developed through decades of experience with controlled demolitions in tactical environments. The training was designed to teach methodical approaches to problem solving that prioritized mission success while minimizing unnecessary risks to personnel and equipment. What Skylar demonstrated during this phase represented a level of expertise that existed far beyond standard military training. Her approach to charge calculation involved spatial analysis and material assessment that reflected not just theoretical knowledge, but extensive practical experience with explosive devices in actual combat environments. She worked with the kind of confident precision that spoke of having performed similar operations under conditions where mistakes carried lethal consequences. The calculations she performed were completed with remarkable speed and accuracy, suggesting either exceptional natural ability or training that had developed these skills through extensive repetition under stress conditions. Her handling of the explosive materials demonstrated familiarity that extended well beyond what should have been possible for someone participating in qualification training rather than advanced specialized operations. Lieutenant Colonel Garrison observed this performance from the control room, with expressions that shifted from professional interest to growing concern to something approaching alarm. The capabilities being demonstrated exceeded the parameters that had been used to design the exercise, suggesting that either their assessment methods were fundamentally flawed or someone was participating in the training who possessed qualifications that weren't reflected in official documentation. His decision to authorize the equipment malfunction during the next phase wasn't motivated by the same concerns that drove Captain Donovan's cooperation. Garrison's interest lay in maintaining control over training outcomes and ensuring that results aligned with predetermined conclusions about candidate suitability for special operations roles. Someone whose performance challenged the validity of assessment methods represented a threat to institutional authority that required correction. The encrypted communication system he activated allowed him to implement changes to exercise parameters without requiring official authorization or documentation. The modifications he ordered would create the appearance of system malfunction, while actually representing deliberate sabotage designed to produce specific outcomes that supported predetermined conclusions. The medical emergency simulation that followed was designed to test candidates' ability to provide trauma care under combat conditions while maintaining tactical awareness and mission focus. The scenario involved treating serious injuries using limited medical supplies while under simulated enemy fire, requiring not just medical competence, but the psychological resilience to function effectively when human lives depended on performance under extreme stress. Standard military medical training provided basic trauma care capabilities that allowed personnel to stabilize injuries until professional medical assistance became available. The training emphasized simple procedures that could be performed quickly with limited equipment, focusing on interventions that would keep injured personnel alive during evacuation rather than comprehensive treatment. What Schuyler demonstrated during the medical phase suggested training that extended far beyond standard military first aid. Her approach to trauma assessment and treatment reflected not just competence, but the kind of clinical expertise that required extensive specialized education and practical experience in emergency medical environments. She performed procedures that most military personnel wouldn't attempt without direct supervision from trained medical professionals, displaying both technical skill and clinical judgment that spoke of extensive training in trauma medicine. Her diagnostic capabilities allowed her to quickly identify injuries that others missed, while her treatment methods demonstrated familiarity with advanced medical techniques that weren't included in standard military medical training. Dr. Cross documented these observations with growing professional fascination and personal concern. The medical capabilities being demonstrated required either extensive civilian medical education that wasn't reflected in official documentation or specialized military medical training that was typically reserved for personnel with specific operational requirements that went far beyond standard special operations roles. The psychological profile she was developing suggested someone whose background included elements that created significant discrepancies between official documentation and observed capabilities. The implications raised questions about institutional security and the adequacy of background verification procedures that had allowed someone with undisclosed qualifications to participate in standard training programs. Elite military personnel and defense contractors require specialized financial protection that exceeds standard civilian coverage. Advanced liability insurance frameworks designed specifically for high-risk operational environments provide comprehensive financial security during classified missions and training exercises. These premium insurance packages include coverage for equipment replacement, medical treatment, and legal representation that would be essential for personnel operating in sensitive military capacities, where standard coverage would be completely inadequate for the unique risks involved. The system malfunction occurred during the transition between exercise phases, manifesting as a cascade failure that transformed controlled training environment into something approaching actual combat conditions. Warning lights flashed throughout the facility as computer systems registered anomalies that shouldn't have been possible under normal operational parameters. Safety protocols that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of scenario failed to activate, suggesting either unprecedented technical failure or deliberate intervention by someone with administrative access to critical systems. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came when the ammunition supply systems began dispensing live rounds, instead of the training ammunition that all safety protocols required for facility exercises. The transition occurred gradually enough that initial detection was difficult, but quickly accelerated to the point where candidates found themselves in tactical situations involving actual lethal force rather than simulation. Admiral Blackwater realized the severity of the situation within 90 seconds of the initial malfunction, but discovered that his command authority over facility systems had been compromised through administrative access that he couldn't immediately override. Someone with knowledge of facility operations and security protocols had deliberately created conditions that placed all personnel in immediate danger while making rapid resolution impossible through normal emergency procedures. Evacuation protocols, immediate implementation, he ordered, but discovered that the same administrative intervention that had caused the malfunction had also disabled the communication systems that would allow coordination of emergency response. The facility had been transformed from a controlled training environment into a maze of obstacles where standard emergency procedures were no longer available. His attempts to contact external emergency services revealed that communications interference was preventing contact with outside authorities, suggesting either sophisticated technical attack or inside knowledge of facility vulnerabilities that allowed comprehensive systems compromise. Someone had planned this scenario with careful attention to detail and extensive knowledge of the facility's operational characteristics. Captain Donovan realized that the equipment malfunction he had been ordered to implement was far more extensive than anything he had been told to expect. The encrypted instructions had indicated minor technical difficulties that would provide justification for candidate elimination, not life-threatening system failures that placed all personnel in immediate danger. His cooperation in the initial sabotage had made him complicit in something far more serious than simple training manipulation. The weight of responsibility for the unfolding crisis crushed him with the realization that his moral compromise had contributed to creating conditions that might result in multiple casualties among people who trusted him to maintain their safety during training operations. The leverage that had forced his cooperation now seemed insignificant compared to the consequences of allowing the situation to continue without taking action to protect the people under his command. His decision to reveal the truth about the administrative sabotage represented a choice between personal consequences and moral responsibility that defined the kind of person he actually was beneath the fear and coercion that had temporarily controlled his behavior. The encrypted communication device he activated would provide evidence of the conspiracy while potentially destroying his career and exposing him to criminal prosecution for his role in creating the crisis. Before the biggest reveal of this story, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. What happens next will make your jaw drop. Trust me, you don't want to miss this moment. The crisis escalated rapidly as live ammunition created tactical situations that exceeded the training and experience of most candidates participating in the exercise. Kellerman's aggressive leadership style, which had been effective in controlled training environments, proved inadequate for managing actual combat conditions where mistakes carried lethal consequences rather than simply academic failure. His team found themselves pinned down by suppressive fire that would have been manageable in simulation, but became overwhelming when accompanied by the psychological pressure of knowing that injuries would be real rather than theoretical. The tactical decisions that had seemed obvious in training scenarios became impossibly complex when filtered through the knowledge that wrong choices might result in permanent disability or death. "We need to move now," Kellerman shouted over the sound of gunfire, his voice carrying the kind of desperation that indicated someone who had reached the limits of his tactical experience and psychological resilience. "Stay low, follow my lead, and try not to get anybody killed." His plan involved straightforward assault tactics that reflected training doctrine, but failed to account for the enhanced lethality of the current situation or the psychological factors that were affecting his team's performance. The approach might have worked in simulation, but required modification for conditions that none of them had experienced before. Schuyler assessed the tactical situation with the kind of calm analysis that surprised everyone who observed her during the crisis. While other team members showed signs of stress, confusion, and fear that were natural responses to unexpected life-threatening conditions, she maintained mental clarity and tactical awareness that suggested extensive experience in actual combat environments. Her evaluation of available options, enemy positions, and team capabilities led to conclusions that differed significantly from Kellerman's assessment. The approach she recommended involved tactics that weren't included in standard military doctrine, but reflected adaptive thinking based on understanding of current conditions rather than adherence to predetermined procedures. "The direct assault will get people killed," she said with quiet authority that cut through the chaos and demanded attention from everyone within hearing range. "There's a better way, but it requires trust and coordination that goes beyond standard procedures." The transformation in her tone and bearing was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying careful attention. The deferential politeness that had characterized her interactions throughout the training program had been replaced by professional competence and command presence that spoke of someone accustomed to making critical decisions under extreme pressure. Kellerman stared at her with an expression that combined surprise, suspicion, and growing recognition that his assumptions about team composition and individual capabilities might have been fundamentally incorrect from the beginning. "What are you talking about? You're barely qualified to be here." "I'm qualified for this," she replied with certainty that left no room for argument or negotiation. "The question is whether you're willing to follow tactical recommendations from someone whose background you don't understand." The challenge was delivered without hostility or ego, simply a statement of operational reality that required immediate decision-making based on current circumstances rather than preconceptions about relative capabilities. The crisis had created conditions where performance mattered more than hierarchy, where results would determine survival rather than administrative evaluation. Captain Donovan watched this exchange with growing understanding of what was actually occurring. The encrypted messages he had received had warned him about capabilities that exceeded apparent qualifications, but had failed to convey the extent to which official documentation understated the actual background of the person they were attempting to eliminate from the program. His decision to support Schuyler's tactical recommendations represented not just military necessity, but moral recognition that his earlier cooperation with sabotage efforts had been based on incomplete understanding of what was actually at stake. Someone whose capabilities could potentially save lives in the current crisis deserved support rather than continued undermining. "What do you need from us?" he asked, his tone reflecting official authorization for whatever approach she deemed necessary to resolve the situation safely. The tactical solution Schuyler implemented involved coordination of movement, timing, and positioning that required not just individual competence, but team trust and communication under extreme stress conditions. Her approach utilized facility layout, available equipment, and team capabilities in ways that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of tactical principles combined with practical experience in applying those principles under actual combat conditions. The execution of her plan revealed capabilities that exceeded anything that should have been possible for someone participating in qualification training rather than leading actual special operations missions. Her movement through the facility displayed spatial awareness and tactical intuition that spoke of extensive experience in environments where such capabilities had been developed through repeated exposure to life-threatening situations. More significantly, her ability to coordinate team performance and adapt tactics to changing conditions demonstrated leadership skills that extended far beyond what training programs were designed to develop. She functioned with the kind of operational competence that required not just theoretical knowledge, but extensive practical experience in managing complex tactical situations under extreme pressure. The resolution of the crisis occurred with efficiency that impressed even Admiral Blackwater, whose experience provided him with perspective on what constituted exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances. The tactical approach had minimized casualties while accomplishing mission objectives that seemed impossible given the constraints imposed by the system malfunction. However, the most significant aspect of the resolution wasn't the tactical success, but the questions it raised about who had actually been participating in the training program and what their presence meant for institutional security and operational planning. Someone whose capabilities exceeded official documentation represented either a security breach or an operational asset whose purpose hadn't been disclosed to facility command. Professional development programs designed specifically for elite special operations personnel include comprehensive legal training, advanced tactical instruction, and classified protocol management. These exclusive educational frameworks prepare operatives for the complex legal and operational challenges they face during sensitive missions where standard training would be completely insufficient for the sophisticated requirements of modern warfare. Advanced military education and legal consultation services provide specialized expertise that civilian institutions cannot offer for classified operational requirements. The aftermath of the crisis created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that pervaded the entire facility as personnel struggled to understand what had actually occurred and what it meant for their understanding of institutional security and operational procedures. The technical investigation revealed evidence of deliberate sabotage that required administrative access and comprehensive knowledge of facility systems, suggesting inside involvement that raised questions about personnel screening and security protocols. Admiral Blackwater coordinated the investigation with the kind of methodical attention to detail that had characterized his entire career, but discovered that the evidence pointed toward conclusions that challenged his understanding of what was actually occurring at his facility. The sabotage had been implemented with sophistication that suggested either extensive technical expertise or assistance from personnel with intimate knowledge of facility operations. More troubling was the realization that someone participating in standard training had demonstrated capabilities that suggested involvement in operations that existed outside normal military structure. The implications raised questions about institutional security that extended far beyond simple training program management, potentially affecting operational security at the highest levels of military command. The individual performance evaluations that emerged from the crisis revealed patterns that defied conventional understanding of training effectiveness and capability development. Several candidates had demonstrated abilities that exceeded what their official documentation suggested should have been possible, while others had failed to perform at levels that their credentials indicated they should have achieved easily. Dr. Cross compiled psychological assessments that documented behavioral observations, challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between official qualifications and actual operational capability. The profiles she developed suggested that traditional evaluation methods might be inadequate for identifying individuals whose background included experiences that weren't reflected in conventional documentation. Her recommendations included comprehensive revision of assessment protocols and expansion of background verification procedures to account for the possibility that some candidates might possess qualifications that exceeded what standard investigation methods could identify. The implications extended beyond training program management to questions about institutional security and operational planning that affected special operations capability at the strategic level. Lieutenant Colonel Garrison faced the consequences of administrative decisions that had transformed routine training into life-threatening crisis through deliberate sabotage of safety systems and operational protocols. The investigation revealed evidence of his involvement in creating conditions that placed personnel in immediate danger, while his attempts to cover up that involvement had only created additional security complications. His cooperation with external parties in manipulating training outcomes represented violation of military law and breach of security protocols that carried consequences extending beyond administrative discipline to potential criminal prosecution. The leverage that had motivated his cooperation proved insufficient to protect him from responsibility for actions that had endangered the lives of people under his command. The broader investigation revealed connections to networks of influence that extended throughout multiple military installations and government agencies, suggesting coordinated efforts to manipulate personnel evaluations and operational assignments for purposes that remained unclear but appeared to involve compromise of national security interests at the highest levels. The resolution of immediate crisis had exposed institutional vulnerabilities that required comprehensive response, involving not just local command, but military intelligence and security agencies whose responsibility included protecting against exactly the kind of internal threats that had been identified through the investigation. Captain Donovan's decision to reveal his involvement in the initial sabotage represented a moral choice that cost him his career but potentially prevented far more serious consequences if the conspiracy had been allowed to continue unchecked. His cooperation with investigators provided evidence that led to identification of additional personnel who had been compromised through similar leverage and coercion. The personal consequences he faced included court-martial proceedings and potential criminal prosecution, but also the knowledge that his decision to come forward had prevented additional incidents that might have resulted in multiple casualties among personnel who trusted institutional security to protect them during training operations. His example influenced other personnel to reveal information about suspicious activities and pressure to compromise security protocols, leading to identification of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple training, manipulation, to systematic efforts to undermine special operations capability through elimination of qualified personnel and promotion of compromised individuals. The investigation that followed would eventually reveal connections between the facility's sabotage and broader efforts to compromise American special operations capability through systematic manipulation of personnel evaluation and assignment processes. The implications would affect military policy and security protocols for years to come, but the immediate impact was the realization that someone participating in routine training had prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure of institutional security. As the immediate crisis resolution concluded, and emergency services restored facility safety systems, the focus shifted from tactical response to strategic questions about what had actually occurred and what it revealed about vulnerabilities that extended far beyond simple training program management. The answers to those questions would require investigation that went beyond facility command to involve military intelligence and security agencies whose responsibility included protecting against internal threats to national security. The transformation of routine training into actual combat had revealed capabilities and vulnerabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional security and operational readiness. The resolution had prevented immediate casualties, but had exposed problems that required comprehensive response, involving resources and expertise that extended far beyond what facility command could provide independently. The person whose performance had prevented catastrophic failure remained an enigma whose actual background and purpose were still not fully understood by facility command. The questions about her identity and qualifications would require investigation at classification levels that exceeded local authority, involving agencies whose responsibility included protecting information that affected national security at the strategic level. The immediate aftermath created conditions where continued training was impossible until security reviews could be completed and facility systems could be verified as safe for operational use. The suspension of training operations would have consequences that extended beyond immediate educational objectives to affect operational readiness and personnel development throughout the special operations community. However, the most significant immediate impact was the realization that traditional evaluation methods might be inadequate for identifying individuals whose capabilities extended beyond conventional understanding of training and qualification processes. The implications would require comprehensive revision of assessment protocols and security procedures that affected institutional operations at the fundamental level. The crisis had ended, but the questions it raised were just beginning to be understood by personnel whose responsibility included maintaining the security and effectiveness of America's special operations capability in an environment where threats could emerge from unexpected sources and challenge institutional assumptions about operational security and personnel evaluation. The questions that emerged from the facility investigation would require weeks to answer completely, but the immediate tactical situation demanded resolution that couldn't wait for comprehensive analysis. Admiral Blackwater faced the reality that his training facility had been compromised at multiple levels, while someone whose actual qualifications remained unclear had prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure, resulting in multiple casualties among America's future special operations personnel. The encrypted communication systems that had been used to coordinate the sabotage were still active, suggesting that the conspiracy extended beyond the immediate crisis and might involve additional planned operations at other facilities. The technical analysis revealed sophistication that indicated either state-level resources or extensive insider knowledge of military communication protocols and security vulnerabilities. More immediately pressing was the question of what to do about personnel whose performance during the crisis had revealed capabilities that exceeded their official documentation. Standard protocol required immediate security review and potential detention until background verification could be completed, but the same personnel had just prevented disaster through their exceptional performance under life-threatening conditions. Dr. Cross approached Admiral Blackwater with preliminary psychological assessments that raised additional questions about the adequacy of standard evaluation procedures. Her analysis suggested that several candidates possessed training and experience that weren't reflected in their official files, while others had demonstrated psychological profiles consistent with extensive combat experience rather than standard military preparation. "Admiral, we need to discuss the implications of what we've observed," she said, her professional tone carrying undertones of urgency that reflected the significance of her findings. "The behavioral patterns documented during the crisis suggest capabilities that exist outside normal military training parameters." Her tablet displayed psychological profiles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between official qualifications and actual operational capability. The data indicated that traditional assessment methods might be systematically missing individuals whose background included experiences that weren't captured through conventional documentation processes. Specifically, Admiral Blackwater asked, though his own observations had already suggested conclusions that would require careful consideration and potentially official reporting at classification levels that affected institutional security. Candidate Thorne's performance profile suggests either extensive combat experience or specialized training that would typically require clearance levels and operational background not reflected in accessible documentation. The psychological resilience, tactical thinking, and technical competence demonstrated during the crisis exceed what should be possible without extensive practical experience in actual combat environments. The implications of this assessment created administrative challenges that extended beyond facility command to involve security agencies whose responsibility included protecting against threats to institutional integrity and operational security. Someone whose actual background differed significantly from official documentation represented either a security breach or an operational asset whose purpose hadn't been disclosed to appropriate command levels. The sound of approaching helicopters provided external confirmation that the crisis had attracted attention from agencies beyond facility command. The aircraft approaching the landing zone carried the distinctive markings that indicated military intelligence, rather than standard emergency response, suggesting that the investigation would involve resources and expertise that operated at classification levels exceeding local authority. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb emerged from the lead helicopter with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking control of complex situations that required immediate resolution. His uniform bore the subdued insignia that indicated special operations background, combined with intelligence responsibilities, while his bearing reflected the kind of professional competence that came from managing crises where national security intersected with operational necessity. "Admiral Blackwater," he acknowledged with professional courtesy that carried undertones of authority derived from sources beyond military rank. "I'm here to coordinate the security review and determine what additional resources might be required to address the implications of today's events." His presence indicated that the facility crisis had been recognized at command levels, where decisions were made about resource allocation and operational priorities that affected national security planning. The speed with which specialized personnel had arrived suggested either remarkable response efficiency or prior awareness of potential problems that required immediate attention. "What's your assessment of current security status?" Webb asked, his tone indicating expectation of comprehensive briefing rather than simple status update. Admiral Blackwater provided a summary of events that emphasized both the resolution of immediate crisis and the questions that had emerged about personnel qualifications and facility security. His presentation focused on facts rather than speculation, but the implications were clear to anyone with experience in security assessment and threat evaluation. "We have personnel whose performance suggests capabilities that exceed official documentation, evidence of coordinated sabotage involving administrative access to critical systems, and indicators of broader conspiracy that may affect multiple installations. The immediate crisis has been resolved, but the underlying security issues require investigation and response that exceed facility resources. Webb's expression reflected the kind of professional concern that indicated recognition of problems whose implications extended beyond immediate administrative issues to affect operational security at strategic levels. His response would determine whether the investigation proceeded as routine security review or escalated to involve agencies whose responsibility included protecting against threats to national security. The tactical debriefing that followed involved detailed analysis of individual performance during the crisis, with particular attention to capabilities that had exceeded expected parameters and suggested background that differed from official documentation. The process revealed patterns that challenged institutional assumptions about evaluation, effectiveness, and security verification procedures. Schuyler participated in the debriefing with the same professional courtesy that had characterized her interactions throughout the training program, answering questions with precision while revealing nothing about sources of capability that weren't reflected in accessible documentation. Her responses were technically accurate without providing information that might compromise operational security or reveal details about background that remained classified. Your tactical performance during the crisis exceeded standard parameters for personnel at your documented experience level, Webb observed, his tone carrying professional interest rather than accusation. Can you explain the source of capabilities that enabled performance significantly above expected baseline? Training and experience provide foundation for adaptation under stress conditions, Schuyler replied, her response following protocols for maintaining operational security under questioning while providing technically accurate information. Crisis situations often reveal capabilities that aren't apparent during routine operations. The answer was professionally delivered and factually correct, while revealing absolutely nothing about the actual source of training or experience that had enabled exceptional performance. Her tone conveyed respectful cooperation without providing information that might compromise security or reveal details that weren't appropriate for discussion at current classification levels. Webb studied her with the kind of professional assessment that reflected extensive experience in evaluating personnel whose background might include elements that weren't immediately apparent through standard investigation procedures. His conclusion would determine whether additional investigation was required or whether current security concerns could be addressed through routine administrative review. Petty Officer Rivera observed the debriefing process with growing understanding of complexities that extended far beyond what he had initially recognized. The professional interaction between military intelligence personnel and someone he had assumed was a routine training candidate suggested layers of institutional activity that operated outside his previous experience or knowledge. His own performance during the crisis had been noted by investigating personnel, particularly his recognition of exceptional capability and his decision to provide support rather than participate in the systematic undermining that had characterized other candidates' behavior. The choice reflected personal integrity that had been recognized as significant by personnel whose job involved identifying individuals whose character and capability made them suitable for sensitive assignments. Petty Officer Rivera, Webb addressed him with attention that suggested his actions during the crisis had been evaluated as noteworthy. Your assessment of candidate Thorne's performance and your decision to provide support rather than participate in harassment demonstrated judgment that we value in special operations environments. The recognition carried implications that extended beyond simple acknowledgement to suggest potential opportunities for advancement or assignment to operations that required personal integrity, combined with ability to recognize capability that might not be immediately apparent to others. The investigation into the administrative sabotage revealed connections that extended the scope of required response far beyond facility security review to involve multiple agencies whose responsibility included protecting against internal threats to military capability and operational security. The evidence suggested coordination that required resources and planning that exceeded what individual actors could accomplish independently. Captain Donovan's cooperation in revealing the details of coercion and leverage that had forced his participation provided investigators with information that led to identification of broader networks of influence and compromise that affected multiple installations and personnel. His decision to come forward represented moral courage that was recognized despite the administrative and legal consequences he would face for his initial cooperation with sabotage efforts. The encrypted communication systems used to coordinate the conspiracy were traced to sources that indicated either foreign intelligence involvement or domestic actors with access to resources and information that suggested compromise at levels that affected national security planning. The implications required response that involved the highest levels of military command and intelligence coordination. Staff Sergeant Kellerman faced the professional and personal consequences of behavior that had been documented through facility monitoring systems and witnessed by personnel whose testimony would be part of official proceedings. His treatment of Schuyler represented not just violation of military courtesy and professional standards, but participation in systematic harassment that had potentially contributed to creating conditions where the sabotage could be implemented more effectively. However, his performance during the crisis had also demonstrated courage and tactical competence that partially offset the earlier failures of judgment and character. His willingness to follow tactical leadership from someone he had previously undermined showed capacity for growth and adaptation that was noted by evaluating personnel as potentially significant for future development. The formal proceedings that would address his conduct included opportunities for rehabilitation and retraining that reflected military culture's emphasis on learning from mistakes and developing potential rather than simply punishing failure. The outcome would depend on his demonstration of genuine understanding of what he had done wrong and commitment to developing the kind of character that special operations required. Sergeant Kellerman, Admiral Blackwater addressed him during the formal review of events. Your initial behavior toward candidate Thorne violated standards of professional conduct and military courtesy that are fundamental to special operations culture. However, your performance during the crisis demonstrated tactical competence and courage that suggest potential for development if you can address the underlying character issues that led to earlier failures. The assessment was delivered with professional neutrality that focused on documented behavior rather than personal judgment, providing foundation for administrative action that emphasized correction and development rather than simply punishment. The military's approach to addressing failures reflected institutional understanding that people could learn from mistakes if properly motivated and guided. Kellerman's response would determine whether he received opportunities for continued service and development or faced administrative separation from military service. His demonstrated capability during crisis suggested that appropriate guidance and training might enable him to develop into the kind of personnel that special operations required, but only if he could acknowledge and address the character flaws that had led to his earlier behavior. The facility systems analysis revealed sophisticated penetration that had required not just technical expertise, but intimate knowledge of operational procedures and security protocols that suggested insider involvement at multiple levels. The sabotage had been implemented with understanding of facility operations that exceeded what external actors could have acquired through observation or standard intelligence gathering. The implications pointed toward compromise that extended throughout military special operations, training infrastructure, suggesting coordinated efforts to undermine American capability through systematic manipulation of personnel evaluation and elimination of qualified candidates. The scope indicated resources and coordination that suggested either foreign intelligence operations or domestic conspiracy involving personnel with access to information that affected national security at strategic levels. The response would require comprehensive review of security procedures and personnel verification processes throughout the special operations community, involving resources and expertise that operated at the highest classification levels and affected operational planning for years into the future. The immediate facility crisis had exposed vulnerabilities that required systematic response, involving multiple agencies and command levels. Dr. Cross compiled final psychological assessments that documented the behavioral patterns and capability demonstrations that had emerged during the crisis, providing foundation for recommendations about evaluation procedures and security protocols that would affect institutional operations throughout the special operations community. Her analysis suggested that traditional assessment methods systematically missed individuals whose background included experiences that weren't captured through conventional documentation, while also failing to identify character flaws that became apparent only under extreme stress conditions. The implications required comprehensive revision of evaluation procedures that had been considered adequate for decades. The psychological profiles documented during this crisis challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between official qualifications and actual operational capability, she reported to Admiral Blackwater. Our findings suggest that current evaluation methods may be systematically inadequate for identifying both exceptional capability that exceeds documentation and character flaws that become apparent only under extreme stress. Her recommendations included development of assessment procedures that could identify capabilities and character traits that weren't apparent through standard evaluation methods, involving psychological testing and performance observation that exceeded current protocols in scope and sophistication. The technical resolution of immediate facility problems required extensive system verification and security protocol implementation that would ensure safe resumption of training operations, but the broader implications would affect institutional procedures and operational planning for years into the future. The crisis had revealed vulnerabilities that required systematic response, involving resources and expertise that extended far beyond facility command. However, the most immediate question remained the disposition of personnel whose performance had revealed capabilities that exceeded official documentation and suggested involvement in operations that weren't reflected in accessible files. Standard security procedures required detention and investigation until background verification could be completed, but the same personnel had demonstrated exceptional capability and character during life-threatening crisis. Lieutenant Colonel Webb coordinated with agencies whose responsibility included managing personnel, whose background involved classification levels that exceeded routine military administration, ensuring that security requirements were balanced against operational necessity and individual rights. The process involved consultation with command levels, where decisions were made about resource allocation and operational priorities that affected national security planning. The resolution would determine whether personnel whose exceptional performance had prevented catastrophic failure would be recognized and utilized appropriately or subjected to security procedures that failed to account for their actual contribution to institutional security and operational effectiveness. The secure communication that interrupted the administrative proceedings carried priority designations that indicated immediate attention from command levels where decisions were made about operational deployment and resource allocation. The timing suggested either remarkable coincidence or coordination that had been planned to coincide with the resolution of facility security issues. Admiral Blackwater accepted the encrypted device with professional recognition of communication protocols that indicated involvement of agencies whose operations affected national security at strategic levels. The message content would require immediate response and potentially affect the disposition of personnel and resources that had been involved in addressing the facility crisis. The brief communication provided context that transformed understanding of what had actually occurred during the training exercise and crisis resolution. Information that had been classified beyond facility command level revealed operational purposes that explained anomalies in personnel qualifications and performance that had created administrative confusion and security concerns. The exercise served multiple purposes beyond standard qualification assessment, Admiral Blackwater announced after reviewing the classified communication. Some personnel were participating in evaluation procedures that involved classification levels and operational requirements that weren't disclosed to facility command for security reasons. The revelation recontextualized events that had seemed to challenge institutional security and operational procedures, providing explanation for capabilities that had exceeded documented qualifications and performance that had suggested involvement in operations outside normal military structure. However, the most significant aspect of the communication wasn't the explanation of past events, but the immediate operational requirements that demanded response within hours rather than days or weeks. Crisis situations affecting national security required deployment of specialized capabilities that weren't available through standard military structure, involving personnel whose qualifications and availability weren't reflected in conventional documentation. Schuyler received notification of operational activation through encrypted communication that confirmed her actual status and provided deployment instructions that would require immediate departure from the facility. The timing coincided with completion of security investigation and resolution of administrative issues that had been created by the training exercise and sabotage crisis. Her transition from apparent training candidate to operational deployment revealed the carefully orchestrated nature of events that had seemed to emerge spontaneously from training exercises and security failures. The investigation had served multiple purposes, including security assessment, personnel evaluation, and preparation for operations that required capabilities and clearances that operated outside standard military administration. Commander Thorne, Lieutenant Colonel Webb addressed her with recognition of actual rank and operational status that had been concealed during the training exercise for security and operational reasons. Your performance during the exercise and crisis has been noted at command levels where decisions are made about operational deployment and resource allocation. The acknowledgement provided official recognition of capabilities and background that had been subject to security restrictions throughout the training period, while also confirming operational status that required immediate response to deployment orders that carried the highest priority designations. The facility personnel who had participated in the exercise and witnessed the crisis resolution observed this transition with growing understanding of complexities that had existed beneath surface appearances throughout the training period. Someone they had assumed was a routine candidate had actually been participating in operations that affected institutional security and operational capability at levels that exceeded their knowledge or clearance. The implications challenged their understanding of institutional procedures and security protocols, suggesting that military operations involved layers of complexity and classification that weren't apparent to personnel who operated within conventional administrative and training structures. Captain Donovan received official notification that his cooperation in revealing security breaches and providing information about coercion and leverage would be considered favorably during administrative proceedings that would address his initial participation in sabotage activities. His decision to prioritize institutional security and personnel safety over personal consequences had been recognized as significant by command levels, where decisions were made about personnel disposition and career consequences. The administrative review would still proceed according to military justice procedures, but the recognition of his ultimate choice to do the right thing under extreme pressure provided foundation for resolution that emphasized rehabilitation and continued service rather than simply punishment for initial failures of judgment. His experience would contribute to development of procedures and training that would help other personnel recognize and resist similar coercion attempts, contributing to institutional security through lessons learned from personal experience with moral compromise and recovery. The equipment verification and facility security assessment that followed the crisis resolution involved comprehensive review of systems and procedures that had been compromised during the sabotage operation, ensuring that training could resume with confidence that safety protocols and operational security had been restored to acceptable standards. However, the broader implications required changes to security procedures and personnel verification that would affect operations throughout the special operations community, involving comprehensive review of evaluation methods and administrative procedures that had been considered adequate for decades. The investigation had revealed vulnerabilities that required systematic response involving multiple agencies and command levels, affecting operational planning and resource allocation that would influence military capability and effectiveness for years into the future. Staff Sergeant Kellerman participated in formal proceedings that addressed his conduct during the training exercise, while also recognizing his performance during the crisis resolution. The evaluation process provided opportunities for learning and development that reflected military culture's emphasis on growth and improvement rather than simply punishment for mistakes. His demonstrated capacity for tactical competence and courage under extreme conditions suggested potential for development into the kind of personnel that special operations required, contingent on his ability to address character issues and develop the kind of professional judgment that had been lacking during his earlier interactions with Schuyler. The rehabilitation program available to him included training in leadership, ethics, and professional development that was designed to address underlying attitudes and behaviors that had contributed to his failures while building on capabilities that had been demonstrated during crisis response. Petty Officer Rivera received recognition for his demonstration of integrity and professional judgment during events that had tested character as well as capability. His decision to provide support rather than participate in harassment had been noted as significant by evaluating personnel whose responsibility included identifying individuals suitable for sensitive assignments and leadership development. The opportunities available to him included advanced training and assignment to operations that required not just technical competence, but the kind of character and judgment that he had demonstrated during challenging circumstances. His performance suggested potential for development into leadership roles that would contribute to institutional effectiveness and operational capability. Dr. Cross received authorization to develop comprehensive psychological assessment procedures that would address the inadequacies in current evaluation methods that had been revealed through the crisis analysis. Her work would contribute to institutional improvement that would affect personnel selection and development throughout the special operations community. The research opportunities available to her included collaboration with agencies and institutions whose expertise in psychological assessment and personnel evaluation operated at the highest levels of military and intelligence operations, contributing to knowledge that would improve institutional capability and effectiveness. The facility modifications required to address security vulnerabilities would involve comprehensive upgrading of systems and procedures that had been compromised during the sabotage operation, ensuring that future training could proceed with confidence that appropriate security measures were in place to protect personnel and operations. However, the most significant changes would involve administrative procedures and security protocols that affected operations throughout the military special operations community, requiring coordination with multiple agencies and command levels, whose responsibility included protecting institutional capability and operational effectiveness. The broader investigation that emerged from the facility crisis would eventually reveal connections to security threats that affected multiple installations and operations, requiring response that involved the highest levels of military command and intelligence coordination. The immediate facility crisis had exposed vulnerabilities that had implications for national security planning and operational capability. The resolution of immediate crisis had prevented catastrophic failure, while revealing problems that required comprehensive response involving resources and expertise that operated at classification levels that affected strategic planning and operational deployment. The lessons learned would contribute to institutional improvement that would strengthen American special operations capability for years into the future. If this story gave you chills, you need to see our next video about the female Marine who silenced an entire base. Click the link in the description and keep the momentum going. The departure preparations that began immediately after operational activation revealed the carefully orchestrated nature of events that had culminated in crisis resolution and personnel evaluation. Equipment and transportation that arrived within hours of notification suggested planning that had anticipated operational requirements and prepared resources for immediate deployment. Skylar's transition from training candidate to operational status involved revelation of capabilities and resources that had been concealed throughout the exercise period for security and operational reasons. The equipment provided for her deployment exceeded anything that would have been available to routine training personnel, reflecting requirements and clearances that operated outside standard military administration. The helicopter that arrived for her extraction carried markings that indicated involvement of agencies whose operations affected national security at strategic levels, while the personnel who accompanied it demonstrated professional competence that suggested extensive experience in managing sensitive deployments and operational security. Admiral Blackwater observed the departure with professional understanding of operations that involved classification levels and operational requirements that exceeded facility command authority. His role had been to provide secure environment for evaluation and training that served purposes beyond what had been disclosed to facility personnel for security reasons. Commander, your performance has been noted at levels where operational deployment decisions are made, he acknowledged with recognition of capabilities and background that had been revealed through events that had tested institutional security and personnel evaluation procedures. The lessons learned from this exercise will contribute to improvement that affects institutional capability. The formal recognition provided acknowledgement of contribution that had prevented catastrophic failure while revealing vulnerabilities that required systematic response involving multiple agencies and command levels. The encrypted communication that had initiated operational deployment included information about crisis situations that required immediate response from personnel whose capabilities and availability weren't reflected in conventional military documentation. The timing suggested coordination that had been planned to utilize resources that had been prepared through evaluation procedures that served multiple operational purposes. The specific details of deployment requirements remained classified beyond facility command level, but the priority designations indicated involvement in operations that affected national security planning and resource allocation at strategic levels. As the helicopter lifted off from the facility landing zone, personnel who had participated in the exercise observed departure that revealed complexities they were only beginning to understand. Someone they had assumed was a routine training candidate had actually been participating in operations that affected institutional security and operational capability at levels that exceeded their knowledge or clearance. The implications challenged their understanding of military operations and institutional procedures, suggesting that special operations involved layers of complexity and classification that weren't apparent to personnel who operated within conventional, administrative, and training structures. The facility returned to routine operations, with comprehensive security improvements and procedural modifications that addressed vulnerabilities that had been revealed through the crisis investigation. However, the broader implications required changes that would affect operations throughout the special operations community for years into the future. The investigation had revealed threats to institutional security that required systematic response involving multiple agencies and command levels, affecting operational planning and resource allocation that would influence military capability and effectiveness. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the underlying issues required comprehensive attention that exceeded facility resources and authority. The lessons learned from the exercise and crisis would contribute to institutional improvement that strengthened American special operations capability while addressing vulnerabilities that had been exposed through events that tested security procedures and personnel evaluation methods. The cost of learning had been high, but the knowledge gained would prevent more serious failures that could have affected national security at strategic levels. 6 months later, the institutional changes that emerged from the facility investigation had transformed personnel evaluation procedures and security protocols throughout the special operations community. The psychological assessment methods developed by Dr. Cross had been adopted as standard procedure, while security verification processes had been enhanced to address vulnerabilities that had been revealed through the sabotage investigation. The broader conspiracy that had been uncovered through the investigation had been systematically dismantled through operations that involved multiple agencies and command levels, preventing additional attempts to compromise military capability through personnel manipulation and institutional sabotage. The network of influence and coercion that had threatened institutional security had been neutralized through comprehensive response that protected operational capability and personnel security. The personnel who had participated in the exercise had been reassigned to positions that reflected their demonstrated capabilities and character, with advancement opportunities provided to those who had shown integrity and potential during challenging circumstances. The experience had contributed to professional development that would influence their careers and contributions to institutional effectiveness for years into the future. Captain Donovan had completed rehabilitation procedures that addressed his involvement in initial sabotage while recognizing his ultimate decision to prioritize institutional security and personnel safety. His continued service provided example of military culture's emphasis on learning from mistakes and developing potential, rather than simply punishing failure. Staff Sergeant Kellerman had successfully completed ethics and leadership training that addressed character issues while building on tactical capabilities that had been demonstrated during crisis response. His development into effective special operations personnel provided evidence that people could learn and grow from failures when provided appropriate guidance and opportunities. Petty Officer Rivera had advanced to leadership positions that reflected his demonstration of integrity and professional judgment during events that had tested character as well as capability. His continued service contributed to institutional culture that valued moral courage and recognition of capability regardless of surface appearances. The facility had become a model for security procedures and evaluation methods that protected institutional capability while identifying personnel whose potential might not be apparent through traditional assessment approaches. The lessons learned had been shared throughout the military community, contributing to improvement that strengthened operational effectiveness and security. However, questions remained about operations that continued to involve personnel whose background and capabilities operated outside conventional military documentation and administration. The existence of operational assets whose deployment and utilization weren't reflected in standard military structure suggested complexities that affected national security planning and resource allocation at levels that exceeded routine military operations. The encrypted communication that had activated operational deployment had been the first of many that would require response from personnel whose qualifications and availability weren't apparent through conventional military channels. The nature of these operations remained classified, but their existence suggested that American military capability included resources and expertise that operated outside standard organizational structure and administrative procedures. The investigation that had begun with routine training exercise had revealed institutional vulnerabilities while also demonstrating capabilities that contributed to national security in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged or documented through conventional military administration. The balance between operational security and institutional accountability required careful management that protected both effectiveness and democratic oversight of military operations. As personnel throughout the facility returned to routine operations with improved security and evaluation procedures, they carried knowledge that military service involved complexities and responsibilities that extended beyond conventional understanding of institutional structure and operational requirements. The experience had contributed to professional development that would influence their careers and understanding of service for years into the future. The transformation of routine training into crisis response had revealed both vulnerabilities and capabilities that affected institutional security and operational effectiveness at strategic levels. The resolution had prevented catastrophic failure while demonstrating that American military capability included resources and expertise that operated at levels of classification and complexity that weren't apparent through conventional military structure. The lessons learned would continue to influence institutional improvement and operational planning for years into the future, contributing to military effectiveness and security in an environment where threats could emerge from unexpected sources and challenge fundamental assumptions about institutional procedures and personnel evaluation. The story that had begun with apparent harassment during routine training had revealed complexities that affected national security at strategic levels, demonstrating that surface appearances could be deceiving and that true capability often existed where it wasn't expected or immediately apparent. The implications would influence military culture and operational procedures for generations of personnel who would serve in environments where recognition of potential and demonstration of character remained essential for institutional effectiveness and national security. In a secure facility 3 time zones away, encrypted communications continued to coordinate operations that involved personnel whose existence and capabilities remained classified beyond routine military administration. The mission that had brought Commander Schuyler Thorne to the training facility had been completed successfully, but it was only one of many that required response from resources that operated outside conventional military structure and documentation. The phone that would ring in exactly 37 minutes would initiate deployment to operations that required capabilities and clearances that existed at the intersection of military service and national security responsibilities that couldn't be publicly acknowledged or conventionally administered. The nature of these operations remained protected by classification that exceeded routine military command authority, but their success was essential for protecting American interests and capability in an environment where threats operated outside conventional understanding of military conflict and international relations. The story would continue in environments and operations that couldn't be documented through conventional military administration, involving personnel whose service contributed to national security in ways that required protection through classification and operational security procedures that exceeded routine military operations. Their sacrifice and capability would remain largely unknown and unacknowledged, but their contribution was essential for protecting the freedom and security that allowed democratic institutions and military accountability to function effectively. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the broader mission continued through operations that involved complexities and responsibilities that existed at the intersection of military service and national security requirements that affected strategic planning and resource allocation for years into the future. The success of these operations remained essential for protecting American capability and interests in an environment where threats evolved faster than conventional military structure could adapt and respond. The Secure Operations Center hummed with electronic activity as encrypted communications coordinated deployments across multiple time zones, each message carrying priority designations that reflected operational requirements affecting national security at strategic levels. Commander Skylar Thorne stood before digital displays that provided real-time intelligence about crisis situations, developing faster than conventional military response could address. The briefing she received revealed complexities that extended far beyond the training facility investigation, connecting institutional vulnerabilities to broader threats that required immediate response from personnel whose capabilities operated outside standard military documentation. The conspiracy uncovered at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center represented one node in a network that threatened American special operations capability through systematic compromise of personnel evaluation and elimination of qualified candidates. Operation Arctic Wolf has been compromised at multiple levels, reported Colonel Sarah Albrecht, whose intelligence background provided her with perspective on threats that operated at the intersection of foreign intelligence and domestic vulnerabilities. We have confirmation that similar infiltration attempts are occurring at 17 additional facilities across CONUS and overseas installations. The scope of coordination required resources and planning that suggested either state-level involvement or domestic conspiracy with access to information that affected operational security at the highest levels of military command. The pattern indicated systematic efforts to undermine American special operations capability through methods that avoided direct confrontation while achieving strategic objectives through institutional manipulation. Skylar absorbed this information with the professional assessment that characterized her approach to operational planning, analyzing implications that would determine deployment priorities and resource allocation for missions that carried consequences extending far beyond immediate tactical objectives. Her experience in operations that existed outside conventional military structure provided perspective on threats that required response capabilities not available through standard military channels. "Timeline for interdiction?" she asked, her tone reflecting understanding of operational constraints that would determine success or failure of missions involving classified capabilities and personnel whose existence couldn't be publicly acknowledged or conventionally administered. "Immediate deployment required for primary targets, with secondary operations initiating within 72 hours, Albrecht replied, consulting displays that provided real-time intelligence about threat development and resource availability. Transportation is standing by for insertion at 3 locations where immediate intervention could prevent compromise of additional personnel and operational capability. The mission parameters involved infiltration of hostile networks that had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American military procedures and security protocols, requiring operational approach that combined technical expertise with psychological manipulation to achieve objectives without creating evidence that could compromise broader intelligence operations or reveal capabilities that needed protection through classification. Skylar's preparation for deployment involved equipment and support that reflected requirements for operations in environments where conventional military resources would be inadequate or inappropriate for achieving mission objectives. The gear provided exceeded standard special operations equipment in sophistication and capability, incorporating technologies that weren't available through conventional military acquisition or administration. The psychological preparation required for operations involving deep cover infiltration and extended isolation from support systems had been developed through training that existed outside standard military education, involving techniques for maintaining operational effectiveness while managing stress levels that could compromise mission success or personal survival. Her communications equipment included encryption capabilities that would maintain secure contact with command elements while operating in environments where conventional military communication would be detected and compromised by hostile intelligence services or domestic actors with sophisticated technical capabilities. The helicopter that transported her to the first deployment location carried no identifying markings and operated under flight plans that wouldn't appear in standard military or civilian aviation databases, reflecting operational security requirements that protected both mission success and personnel safety through denial of information that could be used to compromise operations or identify personnel involved in sensitive activities. During the flight, she reviewed intelligence reports that provided detailed analysis of target organizations and individual personalities that would determine operational approach and tactical implementation of mission objectives. The information had been gathered through sources and methods that operated outside conventional intelligence collection, involving human assets and technical capabilities that existed at classification levels exceeding standard military intelligence operations. The primary target facility appeared to be conducting routine military training, while actually serving as recruitment and indoctrination center for personnel who would be placed in positions where they could influence operational outcomes and institutional decision-making throughout the special operations community. The sophisticated nature of the operation suggested coordination and resources that indicated either foreign intelligence involvement or domestic conspiracy with access to classified information and institutional authority. Her insertion into the target environment required identity documentation and background verification that would withstand intensive scrutiny while providing cover for operations that might require weeks or months to complete successfully. The preparation included psychological conditioning that would allow her to maintain cover identity while gathering intelligence and implementing countermeasures that would neutralize threats without revealing the source of intervention. The facility she infiltrated operated with the same professional appearance and routine procedures that characterize legitimate military training installations, making detection of hostile activity dependent on subtle indicators that required extensive experience and training to recognize. The personnel involved demonstrated competence and dedication that made identification of compromised individuals challenging even for someone with her background and capabilities. However, within 48 hours of arrival, patterns emerged that confirmed intelligence assessments about systematic efforts to identify and eliminate personnel whose capabilities exceeded official documentation while promoting individuals whose loyalty had been compromised through coercion or ideological manipulation. The techniques used to achieve these objectives involve psychological pressure, administrative manipulation, and creation of conditions where qualified personnel would be eliminated through apparently legitimate evaluation procedures, while compromised individuals advanced through programs that would place them in positions of authority and influence throughout the special operations community. Her investigation revealed connections between facility command and external networks that provided resources and coordination for operations that affected multiple installations and hundreds of personnel whose careers and capabilities were being systematically manipulated to achieve strategic objectives that served interests opposed to American national security. The countermeasures she implemented required careful timing and coordination to neutralize threats without revealing the source of intervention or compromising ongoing intelligence operations that depended on maintaining cover and operational security. The approach involved creating conditions where hostile networks would be exposed through their own actions, while appearing to result from internal security procedures rather than external intervention. The psychological manipulation required to achieve these objectives involved understanding of individual personalities and institutional dynamics that allowed her to influence behavior and decision-making without creating awareness that external factors were affecting outcomes. The techniques had been developed through training and experience that existed outside conventional military education, involving psychological warfare capabilities that operated at the intersection of individual psychology and institutional behavior. The resolution of operations at the primary target facility occurred within 6 weeks of insertion, resulting in exposure and neutralization of hostile networks that had been operating for more than 3 years while appearing to represent legitimate military training and evaluation procedures. The success prevented compromise of an estimated 200 qualified personnel while identifying 47 individuals whose loyalty had been compromised through various forms of coercion and manipulation. However, the intelligence gathered during the operation revealed connections to additional networks that required immediate attention to prevent expansion of hostile influence throughout the special operations community. The scope of coordination indicated resources and planning that suggested the threat was far more extensive than initial assessments had indicated. The deployment to secondary targets required modification of operational approach based on lessons learned from initial mission success and intelligence gathered about adaptive capabilities demonstrated by hostile networks in response to security pressure. The organizations involved had shown sophisticated understanding of counterintelligence procedures and ability to modify operations to avoid detection while maintaining effectiveness in achieving strategic objectives. Her second deployment involved infiltration of an installation where the hostile network had achieved deeper penetration of command structure, requiring operational approach that involved greater risk and more complex psychological manipulation to achieve mission objectives without compromising ongoing operations or personnel safety. The facility operated under command of personnel whose loyalty had been compromised through sophisticated psychological manipulation and coercion, involving family members and financial pressure that made resistance difficult even for individuals whose fundamental loyalty remained intact. The situation required careful assessment of individual psychology and motivation to determine who could be recovered and who represented permanent security risks. The techniques used to gather intelligence and implement countermeasures involved extensive psychological warfare capabilities that allowed her to influence institutional dynamics and individual behavior while maintaining cover identity and operational security. The approach required months of careful preparation and implementation, involving sustained psychological pressure that tested her own resilience and capability while achieving objectives that prevented compromise of critical operational capability. The success of these operations contributed to comprehensive disruption of hostile networks that had threatened American special operations capability through systematic compromise of personnel evaluation and institutional decision-making. The intelligence gathered revealed the full scope of coordination and resources that had been devoted to achieving strategic objectives through methods that avoided direct confrontation while undermining institutional effectiveness and operational capability. The broader investigation that resulted from operational intelligence led to identification and neutralization of networks that had been operating in 17 countries and affecting operations throughout the global special operations community. The scope of coordination indicated planning and resources that confirmed state-level involvement in systematic efforts to undermine American military capability through institutional manipulation and personnel compromise. The lessons learned from these operations contributed to development of security procedures and evaluation methods that would protect against similar threats while maintaining institutional effectiveness and operational capability. The cost had been high in terms of personnel affected and resources required for response, but the knowledge gained would prevent more serious compromise that could have affected national security at strategic levels. The recognition she received for operational success remained classified beyond routine military administration, but contributed to advancement and assignment to operations that required her unique combination of capabilities and experience. The nature of her continued service would remain largely unknown and unacknowledged, but her contribution was essential for protecting American interests and capability in environments where threats evolved faster than conventional military structure could adapt and respond. 6 months after the completion of Arctic Wolf operations, encrypted communications continued to coordinate deployments and missions that involved personnel whose existence and capabilities remained protected through classification that exceeded routine military command authority. The threats that required response continued to evolve and adapt, demanding constant vigilance and capability that operated outside conventional understanding of military conflict and international relations. The phone that rang at precisely 0300 hours carried encryption that identified operational priority, requiring immediate response to crisis situations that affected national security at strategic levels. The mission briefing would reveal complexities that tested capability and resolve while contributing to protection of freedom and security that allowed democratic institutions and military accountability to function effectively in an environment where threats operated outside conventional understanding of warfare and international law. The story continued through operations that couldn't be documented or publicly acknowledged, involving sacrifice and capability that remained largely unknown but essential for protecting American interests and values, in a world where the price of freedom required constant vigilance from those whose service existed, at the intersection of military dedication and national security responsibility that exceeded conventional understanding of military service and personal sacrifice.